So, the second block is entitled A New Renaissance and Rejecting Earlier Taboos of Nordic Cooperation in Regionalizing Europe. This block deals with 4 subtopics that will be presented by our speakers. So I'd like to welcome again from left to right. Oh, I made a mistake. Okay. Mats Braun from Institute of International Relations, Czech Republic. Mr. Jan Jireš from Prague Center of Transatlantic Relations, CEVRO Institute. Mr. Kenneth Broman from Nordic Council of Ministers, Finland. And Mr. Rikard Bengtsson from University of Lund, Sweden. So thank you for being here. After the whole block, there will be again a time for your questions and comments. So now I'd like to introduce Mr. Kenneth Broman presenting Nordic institutional cooperation today. So Mr. Broman, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I think we are a bit late, so I'm going to try to cut a few corners and have a few reflections. I think it was very interesting here, this first block, and one food for thought came from the Icelandic ambassador. It's striking that the whole area of the northwest corner of Europe is not a member of the EU, and I know that the people in this area are known to be very stubborn, but that cannot be the whole reason for it. I think the thing about fisheries needed to be reevaluated in the EU system. Well, I want to first of all express my gratitude to the organizers for a very well chosen topic. For us who works with the Nordic cooperation on a daily basis, it's very encouraging to see something happening on this topic, and so far from our normal operational area. And as I will tell you later on, we don't have much business in Central Europe. We work up in our area, so it's very interesting and encouraging indeed. I will split up my presentation in 3 parts. First of all, I will briefly present the Nordic Council of Ministers, its structures, institutions, and how it works. Then I will focus, secondly, on our international activities, the guidelines, the political frameworks which defines all the things we do internationally. And in this respect, I will underline that international activity, when we talk in the Nordic Council of Ministers, is everything happening outside the Nordic countries' borders. Because the Nordic cooperation in itself is international. It's 5 countries and 3 autonomous areas. And then lastly, I will try to argue a bit about added value for the Nordic cooperation and Nordic surplus. Well, first of all, the Nordic Council of Ministers, as it was mentioned in the introduction by the Norwegian ambassador, the institutional cooperation now consists of the Nordic Council, founded in 1952, and the Nordic Council of Ministers in 1971. But of course, the Nordic cooperation as such is age-old and rests on geographical, historical, and cultural coherence. But I am now talking more about the Nordic Council of Ministers. Actually, Council of Ministers consists of 11 different councils. We have Ministers of Finance, Minister of Culture, Minister of Environment, Minister of Justice, and so forth and so forth. It's led by the Prime Ministers, who have meetings 2 and 3 times a year, always in Nordic Council session, when the budget is decided upon. And then in every Nordic government there is appointed 1 minister in charge of Nordic cooperation. And they are leading the daily work in the Nordic Council of Ministers. And concerning the international activities, it's the Nordic Ministers of Cooperation who are actually taking the decisions here. But the civil servants are in the Minister of Foreign Affairs. So there's a mishmash. Normally the Ministers of Cooperation comes from different ministries, but the civil servants are in the Minister of Foreign Affairs. More about Nordic Council of Ministers. At the moment we have 22 different institutions, and they are very different. They are more or less expert institutions on research, on education, we have one on Iceland, which are experts on volcanoes, and they were very active when we had a few years ago this big volcano in Iceland who erupted and stopped the air traffic in big parts of Europe. Then this institution was on CNN and everywhere all the time, explaining to the world what's happening and when the ash is going to disappear. We have Nordic houses, especially in Reykjavik and in Iceland and in Faroe Islands are big Nordic houses, and then we have on Greenland as well. So they are quite different, these institutions. We have 5 offices, and they are mainly our muscles in our neighborhood policy. These are offices in the east. So we have an office in St. Petersburg, in Riga, in Tallinn, in Vilnius, in Kaliningrad. And then we have one-man offices in the northern parts. That's in Petrosavorsk, Arkhangelsk, and Murmansk. And these offices are very central to actually execute our neighborhood policy, which I'm going to present to you a bit closer. Headquarters for the cooperation is in Copenhagen, where the Nordic Council of Ministers Secretariat is, where I am as well. And lastly, I want to mention that the Nordic Council of Ministers and the Nordic Cooperation is not an overnational cooperation, as now Europe is at the theme here. So the decisions are taken unanimously, and it has not an overnational character. And therefore, sometimes it takes a bit time to get all the details in every agreement. I will say a few words about this is the government's cooperation. Then we have the Nordic Council, which are the interparliamentary cooperation, and that's the oldest one, founded in 1952. And there are 87 parliamentarians, and could be compared with the European Parliament, even though it's not directly elected. The members of parliament are appointed by their own parliament in a delegation, and they meet many times a year and have a session once a year where many important Nordic issues are discussed and important decisions taken. This is in a nutcase what the Nordic Council of Ministers is, and I will not spend more time on this organizational thing. I will move on more to what we do. Well, I could say a bit so you can understand the budget. It's about 1 billion. We have, because we are in Copenhagen, our budget currency is Danish kroner, but if I translate it to euros, we have a budget about 150 million euros and for the total. And people working in the headquarters, we are about 130, and if you take all the institutions and offices, we are about 400 to 500 people, different on how you count them. We have lots of students and practicants and so forth. So that's the size of the cooperation. But moving on to more the international aspects, and starting with the budget again to show how important it could be. About 20% of the total budget goes to what we could call international cooperation. And that is in euros about 26 million euros. So it's a quite big lot which actually goes to the international, knowing that the Nordic cooperation in itself, it's founded to deepen the relations between the Nordic countries and not looking so much out. And that has been very successful. If we look historically, we managed in the 60s and 70s to have free movement of labor capital and so forth. So, and that has, of course, been a tremendous advantage for all the Nordic countries to have this during many economical fluctuations. I'm going to go with different directions geographically to briefly tell you about our activities internationally. And I will start in the north, where we have the Arctic cooperation. We have an Arctic program running, and the Nordic Council of Ministers is an observer in the Arctic Council. And this notably is at the same time as the Nordic countries are members of the Arctic Council. So there is like an extra place in the Arctic Council, and we are quite active there. We have been very active in founding the Arctic Council. We have been there from the start, and in the Nordic policies, Arctic policy is very important. And of course it's mostly Denmark via Greenland and Norway, who is a superpower in the Arctic, as we say, and of course Iceland. But Finland and Sweden is very active, and for the moment we have a Swedish chairmanship in the Arctic Council, and as you know, the Arctic question is now very hot on the international arena, because now the big players are moving. Now we have the United States and Russia taking real interest in this. We have nations as China and Brazil and India applying to be observers in the Arctic Council. And of course this is trade policy. This is ensuring the routes when the ice is melting and you get new routes, you need to be by the table because they have to ensure their exports. And we are very proud of what we've done in the Arctic, and it has been a very, very fruitful cooperation. And then we look to the east. And that's, of course, is where most of our activities is. First of all, we have guidelines for cooperation with Northwest Russia. And budget-wise, it's a quite big cooperation. And as I mentioned, we have two offices. We have an office in St. Petersburg and in Kaliningrad, and then smaller offices. And we have very good relations with Russia on these matters. And the areas we are focusing on in Russia is education, research and innovation, environment, climate and energy, economic cooperation and trade, and then of course the Northern Dimension partnerships and Northern Dimension as such, which, if you put it bluntly, is an instrument for the European Union to cooperate with Russia with. And we are quite an active part in this one. And then, of course, democracy and civil society. We are working a lot on anti-corruption and together with other European institutions in this area. This takes quite much effort, and we put a lot of energy in our cooperation with Northwest Russia. All these guidelines are decided by the governments of the Nordic states. And then we have guidelines for cooperation with the Baltic states, which we always say Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, because they themselves don't always like to be called the Baltic states. It's a thing with them. And of course there the cooperation is a bit different. The Nordic countries were first on ground after they regained their independence in the beginnings of the 90s, and our offices in the Baltic states are actually founded before the Nordic embassies got their representations on location there. So we have been there from the start, and the Nordic countries have felt a responsibility for the Baltic states from the beginning, since they regained their independence with the ending of the Cold War. But in the guidelines with the cooperation with the Baltic states, here again we focus on education, research and innovation. It's on business clusters, creative industries, environment, climate, energy, and then welfare societies and cross-border regional cooperation. In a way, the cooperation we do with the Baltic states differs a lot from what we do with Russia, of course. And it's on equal basis. The Baltic states are today full members of many of the programs we are running. For example, they are full members of the Nordic Investment Bank today, and many other institutions. And it's no secret that Estonia, especially Estonia, they consider themselves as a Nordic country, and they have their long-planned strategy to become the 6th Nordic country. And they are waiting for the right timing to fulfill an application. While Lithuania and Latvia don't really have the same cultural background. And Estonia, for those people who know, are quite close to Finland in many language-wise and otherwise. Still looking to the east, we have a quite new and not so normal, and I wouldn't call it a cooperation, it's called Guidelines for Activities with Belarus. Belarus, as you know, has been a problem area in Europe for a while, and it started about 6 years ago when President Lukashenko closed the university in Minsk. And the rest of Europe didn't really like that, and this was before my time, but at that time a commissioner from the EU Commission came to the Nordic Council of Ministers and said, we have to do something. And we, of course, discussed this with our governments and designed a trust fund together with the EU Commission and moved the university to Vilnius, 20 kilometers from the border to Belarus. Today we drive this trust fund together with the European Commission. It has now about 12 million euros in it, and there are 14 different governments donating directly. And then we have the Americans aboard, and we are actually driving a university, European Humanities University it's called. And that was the start for our Belarusian, you couldn't call it cooperation, but you could say activities. And today it has 2,000 students, and it's a very, as I understood, academically the level is rising all the time in this. The last years, again, in cooperation with the European Union, there have been two programs where the Commission has come to the Nordic Council of Ministers and asked us to develop some programs. And this was the aftermath of the presidential election in 2010 December, when we had the riots, and there was a political pressure in Brussels that something needs to be done to help the victims. And then again, because we have an office in Vilnius who has lots of expertise on this, and we have people in our network who knows Belarus, so we designed a program, CSSB it's called, which helps in 3 different measures. I won't go into details. The families, the victims, the media. It's about 2 million euros going into that. So we are driving this, and last week I heard that the Commission wants to continue this program now for several years. And then lastly, we have a scholarship program for the European Union as well, and going basically trying to send young Belarusians out in European universities to take whole bachelors. And this is, of course, to secure the time after Lukashenko. We have guidelines to the West. This is cooperation with Canada, United States, mostly. This is quite new and quite small, and it's a demand, of course, from Greenland, because they think that everything is so much east and Baltic Sea, and we have neighbors to the other side as well. So this is quite new. And then I want to mention, concerning the European Union, of course, our interest is the Northern Dimension and the Baltic Sea Strategy, where we are very active partners. We are involved in over 100 projects in the Northern Dimension and actually carrying it forward very quietly. And the same thing is in the Baltic Sea Strategy. Time is running. I promised I would say a few words about added value. The Nordic countries are quite small. Together we are about 25 million people. But there is one thing. If you look at our economy, together we are the 10th biggest economy in the world. And that has some meaning. We could be members of G20, as the Norwegian minister a couple of years suggested, meaning if we act together, we can make things happen. But if we stand alone, we are quite small, insignificant players. And historically, we have done that in many, not only in the formal Nordic cooperation, but you can see very, very good added value in this. I have some examples on this, but I will look historically as well. If you look at international comparisons on life expectancy, on wealth, on education, on transparency, the Nordic countries are always in top 10, all 5 of them. Normally 1, 2, 3, 5. And of course this is something we are very proud of, but in my opinion this wouldn't be the case if we wouldn't have created free movement of people, goods, capital, markets already in the 60s and 70s. One concrete example, in the 70s when we had economic problems in Finland with big unemployment, and Sweden was driving in very fast speed, 100,000 of Finns moved to Sweden to work. This was good for Sweden, this was good for Finland. It created real economic value. This is historically. This works today as well. Many of the things we do in the neighborhood policy in Russia, of course, is trying to create stable societies in our neighborhood to get better business, to get stability, to get democracy, to avoid corruption, which of course is good for all of us. And this is more or less I could talk a long time on this added value, but this is how we think and how we try to work, and everything we do, we always look at through the glasses of added value. I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was a nice presentation, and I hope that we will stay in this topic during the discussion. So, second presentation is entitled Nordic Informal Foreign Security and Defense Policy Cooperation, presented by Mr. Rikard Bengtsson. Mr. Bengtsson.
Thank you. This topic is a novel one in the Nordic context, and it is no coincidence that Kenneth didn't speak much about defense and security cooperation. The reason is, of course, that this has been a taboo in many ways in you could say way back, but especially in the post-Cold War, in the Cold War period. Some of you may have heard of this notion of the Nordic balance being a very sensitive concept for relations among the Nordic countries based on the sort of outcome of the 1940s in the sense that some Nordic countries joined NATO, others stayed outside of the military alliances, and Finland's special relationship to the Soviet Union. And the Nordic balance is, in terms of the mindset, still very much relevant among policymakers, although some of the fundamental parameters of the security situation in the Nordic context are now changed. So one may pose the question, is there something in the area of security and defense cooperation among Nordic countries? And the answer is yes. Actually, both because there has been for a long time, despite the sensitive security situation, and because there are some novelties in recent years developing. And the background here is to be found in two, you could say concepts that are very important. One is the conceptualization of security in itself, where there are commonalities among the Nordic countries, but also differences. And the other one, I'll come to that in a second, is on global security. These two are related. Regarding the security concept as such, I would say all Nordic countries share what is usually referred to as the human security understanding of security. Meaning then a focus not only on state sovereignty and state security, but also on the security of the individual and all aspects that follow with that, which means, in essence, a much broader conceptualization of security than the hardcore idea that has dominated politics for a long time. But at the same time, the interpretation in terms of territorial defense is varying among the Nordic countries, so that the approach of, for instance, the Swedish defense in recent years is different from, should we say, the Finnish approach to this to the issue of territorial defense. So there is something of a tension here, and where the two come together is most easily seen on the global level. So in the context of the United Nations, also historically, with a focus on peacekeeping and peace building and so on, there is a common view among the Nordic countries. When we move closer to the geographically confined context of the Nordic or of the Baltic Sea region, things are different. And it's in that light the novelties become so interesting. I think it's fair to say that there has been a Europeanization of Nordic security and defense policy. And there are a number of components to that. One is the dynamics of NATO cooperation. We have in the Nordic Circle both NATO members and non-members, but the non-members are very closely linked to NATO through the Partnership for Peace program, for instance. That is then Sweden and Finland in a long period of time now cooperating very closely with NATO. Could also see this actually on the ground in terms of engagement for instance, in the NATO-led Libya operation. But there is also Europeanization of Nordic security and defense in the EU structures. The development of the common foreign and security policy and the common security and defense policy involves the Nordic countries in various ways. Also to the degree that Sweden and Finland, although they are non-aligned, have been very active in promoting that development in the EU. Maybe one shouldn't say although, and rather say because there is some kind of interesting link in that context. And in the EU structures, both on the ground again, in terms of, for instance, the Nordic Battle Group, but also institution-wise in Brussels, and on the policy idea level, civilian crisis management, bringing in the broader conceptualization of security into the EU context. There is, I would say, quite advanced forms of cooperation in this field. So it is a question of overcoming the taboo, yes, in the very strict sense of defense cooperation among the five only. But in various other contexts, there is a background and there is a process ongoing. In the Nordic context itself, there are novelties now that are quite formal, I would say, despite the title of the presentation. And in a sense, the most significant development in that light is the so-called NORDEFCO, the Nordic Defense Cooperation, which came about a couple of years ago, 2009 formally, and involves fundamentally defense capabilities cooperation. But the immediate question, if we look throughout the literature on regional cooperation, for instance, is to ask, is it only functional cooperation, or is there more to it? Or will there be more to it in the future? Now that the door has opened, will it stay with very practical, functional equipment issues, or can it evolve also into more political issues? We don't know that at the time, but I think the question is relevant. Also, and not unrelated to this NORDEFCO, is the issue of a number of civilian, you could call it civilian security cooperation areas, maritime surveillance, civilian crisis management on a Nordic or from a Nordic perspective, and so on. Some of that goes back to what is called a Stoltenberg report that some of you may have heard of, which was a publication listing very concretely a number of issues where the Nordic countries could make a difference if they joined forces, so to speak. And most of that then in the civilian sector. Some of it has not been accomplished yet. Some of it may be unrealistic, but it goes in the same direction of overcoming the taboos of the Cold War. And maybe symbolically most important of all is the Nordic Solidarity Declaration from a year ago, April 5th last year, which is on paper an agreement among the five countries to assist each other in situations of severe threats and dangers and crises. With relevant means is the wording, which means that it need not necessarily be military-wise, but in ways that either the country under threat or the contributing country feels more appropriate. The Declaration on Solidarity has been criticized for being irrelevant or unnecessary, given that many make the interpretation that we have Article 5 of the NATO Charter on common defense, and we have our collective defense, and we have a political solidarity mechanism in the EU, which would cover all situations that the Nordic Declaration can reasonably be about. At the same time, friends of the Declaration argue that the symbolic value of this is the big thing. That there is now, let's say, contractual relations among the Nordic 5 in an area that up until very recently was not touched by the Nordic countries themselves. So bringing this together, quite short presentation, but maybe you're happy about that. It means that, in my interpretation, we're now reconciling local security dynamics with the global security dynamics. And I think it will be, if nothing else, easier to grasp the picture of Nordic security in the years to come. There are interesting issues that are on the agenda in terms of developments in the EU in this field. The profile of the coming operations and missions under the CSDP, for instance. There are interesting issues in the United Nations, for instance, regarding Nordic candidates for seats in the Security Council, with Finland coming up and later Sweden also moving in that area. These will be, if not test cases, at least indications of how strong, how important, how viable this new idea of security in the defense and cooperation in the security and defense area really is. I think I stop here and return in the questions session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bengtsson. Now I'd like to introduce Mr. Mats Braun, presenting the role of regional cooperation in the EU.
Thank you very much. First of all, let me say thank you to the CEVRO Institute for once more organizing an interesting conference on a topic related to the Nordic region. The question I will address during my presentation today is, does regional cooperation, does the Nordic collaboration have an impact on decision-making within the European Union? That is what I will address during the first part of my presentation. During my second part, I will turn to the second half of the title of my presentation, if the Nordic collaboration within the European Union in any way can be seen as a model for the Visegrad Group. So if we start with the first question, can we assume the Nordic countries to collaborate more with each other within the Council of the European Union than they do with other EU member states? Of course, when I say Nordic countries here, this needs to be specified, but I think this is clear from the first panel, but only to make sure only 3 of the Nordic countries are actually members of the European Union. And even if, as both ambassadors said during the first panel, we can describe Norway and Iceland as very much being inside, even if being outside, or as some scholars actually use the strange label, being non-member member states of the European Union. When it comes to decision-making, I think Jens Stoltenberg once said, before becoming Prime Minister of Norway, that Norway has some kind of fax democracy, in the sense that they will receive a fax from Brussels, what is decided upon there. This is, of course, an exaggeration of what is actually going on. You find a lot of experts taking part in working groups, etc. But what is important for my presentation here, and the topic which I'm discussing here, is the actual decision-making, in the Council, and there they are not taking part. And if we look at the 3 member states of the European Union from the Nordic countries, Denmark, Sweden and Finland, as also mentioned during the first panel, there are traditional rather big differences between them. In the 1990s, there used to be a description that Finland was the good student in the class, a metaphor used to basically argue that Finland was the one taking part in all parts of the European Union collaboration. Basically that we introduced the euro, but also that we were allegedly less reluctant in the general approach, whereas Sweden and Denmark were described as slightly more reluctant. I don't know if that holds true anymore. There was discussion about this in the first panel, and I will not really go into it here, but only conclude that if you will you can also have a look at the Eurobarometer opinion polls, and you will see that, for instance, the Danes belong to the most pro-European of all population within the EU. But let me turn to the topic. But before we do that, I will just follow up on what Kenneth Broman here said, that the Nordic collaboration within the EU is very much of a Nordic-Baltic collaboration. Most of the collaboration, a lot of collaboration takes the format Nordic-Baltic 6. That is, the Nordic states which are members of the EU plus Estonia, Lithuania and Latvia, the Baltic states. Just a small point I wanted to follow up on Kenneth here. There was an interesting discussion in Estonia in the 1990s, and there is a very funny article written about it by an Estonian sociologist called Mikko Lagerspets. You will find it in the journal Cooperation and Conflict. He wrote about discussions in the MFA about changing the name of Estonia in English to Estland to make it sound a little bit more Nordic. And there, allegedly, according to this article, also discussion about changing the Estonian flag to have a cross there, to make it look a little bit more similar to the flags of the Nordic countries. I don't know how far this discussion actually went, but this is about identity construction and the importance of identity. But then, as I said, what I wanted to discuss here is, does regional cooperation matter within the Council of the European Union? There is actually quite a lot of research made on this issue. The question is rather, are there actual stable coalition patterns within the Council? Because the standard answer you will get if you ask anyone taking part in those negotiations, and also what used to be the standard answer from political science literature, would be to say, well, there are no such patterns, it's issue-based. But I think the research actually show that it's not really the case, that you find rather stable coalition patterns. But the point, which I will prove in 3 steps, is actually that groupings such as the Nordic countries, or the Benelux, or the Visegrad play a rather marginal role here. But geography definitely matter. Well, how do then the researchers go about to find an answer to this good question? If it is a good question. But they go about it. There are some research made on the question, how do actually people vote in the Council? There are only one problem with this, or a few problems with this research. That is that in the records you only find when there is a positive outcome. Basically, you only find when there is actually voting going on, and when there is not a blocking minority stopping the proposal to be adopted, because that is not recorded. So basically, you have biased data from the beginning. But then, what are the results of this research? To go to the results here, can we find any proof of Nordic collaboration if we look at the outcome of votes? Well, the most recent research I found using this kind of approach argue that there is clearly Denmark and Sweden, they both stick out as being the countries voting most often against. So that is then also linked to the discussion about Danes and Swedes as being reluctant Europeans. But this does not necessarily have to say very much, given that often the outcome is clear. It's just showing that these 2 countries have had, in several occasions, more than other countries, the need necessary to show that they were against the decision. If you will look at this statistic, it's also clear that you don't find the big member states voting too often against any proposal, basically because if there are 2 big states being against, they can easily find a few other states, and then it does not really come down to the voting. They can block it. But still, the main finding from this kind of research is that, yes, if you try to make some cluster analysis and you try to make some groupings based on voting, you find that there is clearly a geographical-based division within the European Union. You have, on the one hand, northern countries grouped together, but that is not the Nordic countries. That are northern countries in the sense the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, Sweden, Denmark. Finland, for some reason, does not always belong to this group. On the other hand, you find some Mediterranean states being shaping one group. Most France, Italy, Spain. So clearly geography matters. But as I said, there are some shortcomings with this research based on voting. So the second alternative would be to look at the preferences. What the preferences that the countries state about different proposals being discussed in the Council. And basically the results of this research is very similar. It shows again that there is a north-south division, and sometimes we will also point at a slightly east-west. But there is no really proof of the Nordic countries as a group, or the Benelux countries as a group, or the Visegrad countries as a group being very much shaping coalitions. But the objections all I have said so far is that I have not really been talking about how to build a stable coalition, because there are a lot of talking going around. And what we normally say is the Nordic ministers, they meet each other more often. They meet each other before the prime ministers meet in the Nordic Baltic 6 format before the European Council. You have meetings of the foreign ministers before the Foreign Affairs Council. You have meetings of foreign affairs ministers and EU affairs ministers before the General Affairs Council, etc. So if we look at networking, within the European Union, then we will see that these countries actually form groups. There has been rather interesting research about this being done from the Gothenburg University in Sweden. And they have basically come to the conclusion that if you ask, by asking diplomats taking part either in COREPER or work in various working groups below that level, but still the same pattern as I told you before repeats itself. You don't actually find any proof of the Nordic countries collaborating more often. What you find is that there is a northern dimension, meaning that Swedes, Britons, Danes, and Dutch tend to collaborate very much. But Finland sticks a little bit out of being a little bit in a different category, according to this research. So again, it's rather interesting. It shows that the geography matters, but not necessarily these institutionalized groups. The same finding has been made regarding the Benelux in this respect. Regarding Visegrad, it's a little bit different. It seems that they are actually talking much more to each other than to the other countries. But to be fair, maybe we should not look using this kind of studies using a lot of quantitative data only. We could also take case studies, and then you actually find specific cases where Nordic collaboration has managed to make a difference on EU level. You can take, for instance, I know that my colleague here, Rikard Bengtsson, spent a lot of time studying Nordic states' EU presidencies at the turn of the century. And if you would follow these presidencies, started with Finland in 1999, I think Sweden 2001, and thereafter Denmark 2002, you can find that they managed to collaborate in the sense that they managed to push really for the northern dimension, the so-called northern dimension. So in that sense, you can of course find examples where they managed to make a difference. But if we look at for a bigger quantity, it's very hard to find evidence that this kind of collaboration would make a big difference. So then, what about the V4 cooperation? As I said, I promised also in the title that I would discuss a little bit what Nordic collaboration could, if it could serve as a model for Visegrad. In one way, of course, this is maybe a question which is raised a little bit too late. It has already happened to some degree, I would argue. I mean, if you look at Visegrad cooperation, in the beginning it has already reached its original purpose. All the countries have successfully entered the European Union, successfully entered NATO. What we do now within the EU is, among others, that we also have informal meetings prior to Council meetings, European Council meetings, also at lower levels, at the level of COREPER, at the level of anti-key-mertens, and so on. So we do have regular meetings, but it's of course as the same as I said, for the Nordic countries, it's questionable how much it has an impact on actual decision making. I would argue that there is a bigger problem for Visegrad countries in the sense that the Nordic countries, their collaboration, the Nordic collaboration, enjoys very strong, very deep popular support. The if you would ask the population in the Nordic countries, very often you will find that they are more positive to Nordic collaboration than to European collaboration, which means that it is a base for stable long-term cooperation. And if you look at the region of the Visegrad countries, you see, of course, that the situation is a little bit different. Not only thinking about the potential conflict between Slovakia and Hungary, but also if we take priorities within the EU. Why would Poland like too much to collaborate with the Czech Republic at the current moment, for instance? I mean, Poland has the interest of being very close to Germany, also for the reason that they want to be at the core of Europe at the current time, whereas you have Czech Republic and Hungary very much going in the opposite direction. So I think I will end there, and looking forward to questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Brown, for your remarkable presentation. And the last speaker is Mr. Jan Jireš with his Comparing the Nordic and Visegrad efforts.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me. I have a not very enviable position of being the last speaker of the day, so I'll try to be a little bit more provocative to prevent you from sleeping. In my contribution, I would like to further speak on the issue of defense cooperation, or to put it differently, speaking about comparing the Nordic region and the Central European region. So my intention actually is to develop some of the issues that have been covered by the two speakers who came before me. Regional cooperation, of course, can be seen as a kind of a spirit of time today. I mean, in both the European Union and NATO, there have been a lot of talking about regional cooperation recently. And my impression is that it is partly, at least partly, caused by the growing worries that actually these broader organizations, such as the European Union and NATO, are losing their coherence and their capacities to deal with issues that some of the smaller countries, such as Central European or Nordic countries, worry about. So, in such circumstances, when both NATO and the European Union as institutions seem to be weakened and losing their ability to act on issues that are seen as relevant by many of their member states, then the regional cooperation naturally starts to be more interesting and perhaps a better vehicle for multilateral cooperation. Of course, another thing is that both the European Union and NATO now has 28, 27 members, and of course the governability of such large institutions then become questionable. And the outcome is that the regional approach suddenly becomes a sort of preferred for many countries. Just to briefly introduce myself, when it comes to issues I've been doing that are relevant for our today's discussions. Currently, I am a part of a 4-country team of experts working on recommendations to Visegrad governments on how best to launch or relaunch a Visegrad regional cooperation in defense. And actually, as a part of this project, my colleagues and I were in Norway and Sweden in January on a sort of a fact-finding trip, trying to understand or trying to assess to what extent actually the Nordic defense cooperation can serve as a good example for our region to follow. And actually the outcome of that fact-finding trip was pretty surprising for many of us, and I'll elaborate on this a bit more later. And actually, just going back to the reasons or motivations behind the contemporary popularity of regional approaches. Some of the people we met in Norway and in Sweden, and they included, the Norwegian defense minister and some high-ranking officials at Swedish defense and foreign ministries. Actually, some of these people, well, not the Norwegian defense minister, okay, so that you don't leave this room with the impression that this was what he suggested. But actually, those nice Swedes told us that actually one of the driving motivations behind developing this Nordefco and solidarity clause you have heard about a couple of minutes ago was actually the decreasing trust on the part of many Nordic governments in NATO and or the European Union actually surviving the next 10 to 15 years as useful and coherent organizations. Actually, in my opinion, the motivations in the Visegrad region for developing regional defense cooperation is different. We dread the idea that either NATO or the European Union would collapse or would cease to serve as useful multilateral framework for our security. What we expect from our defense cooperation in this region is rather strengthening these two organizations. Apart from other motivations like, increasing our military capacities using the same money we have, simply to put it differently, have a bigger bang for the same buck. So apart from this motivation, our regional defense cooperation is primarily meant to make both, especially NATO, but also the European Union, stronger organizations. When comparing Nordic and Central European motivations in this area, it seems to me that there are slight differences. In many areas, of course, as you have heard here many times today, Nordic cooperation has been a model for other European regions to follow. No doubt that when it comes to integrating labor markets, for example, the Nordic cooperation or integration achieved much more and much earlier than the European communities or today the European Union. But I would like to briefly speak about the area in which Nordic cooperation, let alone integration, has not been very successful in my opinion, namely defense. And my goal is to briefly assess to what extent the Nordic defense cooperation experience can be relevant for V4. You have heard a lot from Rikard on what Nordefco is about or what this declaration of solidarity is about. I would like to assess, to what extent really this existing Nordic defense cooperation can be a good example to follow for the Visegrad group. Of course, the Nordic countries see themselves as a sort of norm entrepreneurs. Someone so politically, economically, socially, and of course implicitly also morally superior to the rest of the world that they have a moral duty, so to speak, to spread their postmodern values outside their borders. Another thing is that Nordic countries are extremely good at self-promotion, painting an extremely nice and agreeable picture of themselves. And actually there is a very nice term to describe this. It was a Dutch political scientist came up with it in the 1990s, and the term is the brand state, meaning a state or a country behaving like a commercial brand. Okay, so like a Coca-Cola, using various promotional strategies to promote itself on the international in the international arena. And of course, the Nordic countries along with Canada or New Zealand, have been extremely successful in positioning themselves as these positively looking and very nice and cozy and agreeable brand states. Of course, the reality can be sometimes different. I mean, you can plunge into the Nordic history of the past couple of decades to see that actually the reality has been often very different. Oppressing the Samis in Norway until quite recently, Icelanders wailing happily even today, Sweden having dubious ties to German Nazis during World War II, Finland defying its self-portrait of a progressive international actor by having wanted to keep the landmines as long as possible, and so on, and so on, and so on. Going back to the Nordic defense cooperation, when it comes to defense integration or cooperation, it is really questionable whether it can serve as a model for V4 or Visegrad 4 defense integration and cooperation. It rather seems that the Nordic defense cooperation has been a series of failures. Of course, it is a relatively, a newcomer when it comes to Nordic cooperation, because as has been stressed already before, it really started only in the 1990s, because before, during the Cold War, it was hardly possible due to international geopolitical concerns, essentially protecting the position of Finland vis-à-vis the Soviet Union. So it's true that Nordic defense cooperation is a very new thing, that it started maybe 15, 18, 10, 12 years ago. Of course, we can come up with a number of advantages that may support the Nordic defense cooperation. A number of factors that can help Nordic defense cooperation, and I'm sure that many of them have been mentioned here before in connection maybe to some other integration areas, such as similar political cultures, shared history, shared security concerns, low level of corruption, high quality of public administration. All the Nordic countries are wealthy, and actually their level of wealth is pretty comparable. They have achieved far-reaching integration in other areas, in economy, labor market, and so on. And as Mats has just said, there is a very strong popular support in all the Nordic countries for the regional Nordic cooperation, which is something that is really missing in Central Europe. So taking all this into account, defense cooperation, it seems, should be a very easy thing to do, but it is not even in the Nordic region. The current status of Nordic defense cooperation integration is very underwhelming, to say the least. There is a lot of talking and a lot of self-promotion within NATO, but little behind it in reality. And we can as examples, give a number of things in which really the Nordic defense and security cooperation hasn't gone very far, or actually has gone nowhere. For example, there hasn't really been any pooling and sharing of defense capacities in the Nordic region, with one small exception, which is developing an artillery equipment, by Sweden and Norway. That's the only example of a real pooling and sharing of military capabilities in the Nordic region. And we can argue that actually buying it off the shelf from the Germans or the French would have been much cheaper than actually trying to develop it, between these two countries. There hasn't been any really successful joint procurement of the shelf, conducted by Nordic countries. There is no integrating defense planning, and we've been told, as I told you, I was in Sweden and Norway in January, we were told that essentially this is politically impossible. Essentially, that politicians would never, or for the time being, for the foreseeable future, allow integrating defense planning between the Nordic countries. Apparently, details about the defense planning are not even shared among the Nordic countries. Denmark, in particular, is not really happy about developing Nordic defense and security cooperation, let alone integration. Of course, the reason is, the strong link Denmark has with the United States and NATO. Moreover, developing Nordic defense cooperation doesn't seem to be an automatic thing, like something that naturally, goes forward. There apparently needs to be a good political match between the Nordic governments in office. If the match is missing, if simply the governments have different priorities or there is a mismatch between them, then essentially developing Nordic cooperation in defense becomes much more complicated, and at least changes in government can change the pace of the Nordic cooperation. And last but not least, there hasn't really been any defense industry cooperation in the Nordic region. No real cooperation between Nordic defense industries. The reason now here is Sweden being really, really protective of its home industry. Okay, couple of other things. Apparently, in private, the Norwegians or Danes or Finns will tell you that actually they are not really happy about these Swedish great power pretensions, in the region. That there is essentially sort of not fear, of course, but uneasiness about sort of Swedish domination, and so on and so on. So this is a sort of a snapshot of the current situation when it comes to Nordic defense cooperation. You can see that it is not very impressive, actually. It is nothing really to follow. It is not a very impressive example to follow. Of course, there are a couple of reasons. For that, and this will be my essentially final point. We can, when trying to look for the reasons for these, for this lack of success, so to speak, we can, I guess, identify three different areas. One is strategic culture, the other is strategic orientation, and the third is the different levels of emphasis on sovereignty in different Nordic countries. So when it comes to strategic cultures, it is strategic culture is essentially about how a country or a nation or a society approaches the use of force in international relations or in fulfilling its national interests. And there are huge differences between individual Nordic countries. For example, just contrast and compare Denmark and Finland. Denmark now has a totally mobile military forces that essentially serve the only thing, expeditionary tasks within NATO. So Denmark now has a purely expeditionary army that can, be useful only, in the multilateral framework of NATO, serving in NATO military operations abroad. On the other hand, Finland, of course, still, to a great extent, retains its Cold War military structure. Focusing on territorial defense, having a huge reserve army of some 400,000 reservists, if I'm correct, if the figure is still correct. So, very big differences. Okay, then the second group of reasons, different strategic orientations. This is essentially about partners outside the region. Who are the preferred partners outside, the Nordic region or the Visegrad region. And again, big differences among individual Nordic countries. And of course, the most obvious difference is that essentially these countries have very different international security arrangements, that actually 3 of them are EU members, 2 of them are not, 3 of them are NATO members, 2 of them are not. So actually in this particular regard, then the Visegrad group seems to have much better prospect of forming tangible and working defense cooperation, because all the Visegrad countries, of course, are members of both NATO and the European Union, and it means that their strategic orientation is sort of very similar in contrast to the strategic orientations of individual Nordic countries that are very different. And last but not least, emphasis on sovereignty. We have known Nordic countries as very protective and cherishing their sovereignty. It is very visible within the European Union, for example. But at the same time, this is something that prevents actually, or at least so far, has prevented Nordic defense cooperation to really achieve something, because when you talk to Nordic defense and foreign policy officials, they will tell you quite openly, and it is sort of surprising to Central Europeans to hear that actually there is not enough trust among the Nordic countries to really pool and share sovereignty in this or that defense area. So that, those defense cooperation projects that will depend on giving up a part of your sovereignty. So these projects will take many, many years to develop, because currently, I've been told several times, there is not enough trust among the Nordic countries that would allow those countries to actually give up, parts of their sovereignty in favor of joint solutions or in favor of cooperation or even integration. So, just to conclude, it seems to me that what Central European countries should try to emulate, or where the Nordic region can really serve as an example to follow, is the art of self-promotion. Today, everyone in NATO speaks about Nordic defense cooperation and gives it as a positive example to follow to all the other NATO members. But apparently these people in NATO headquarters do not know how little in practical terms there is behind the lofty rhetorics. Okay. That's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jureš. Well, the block is over now. There is only a discussion, so please, the floor is open to discuss, to debate. If there is anybody who has a question, so please raise your hand and we will give you a microphone. And if there are not any questions, I'd like to... Yeah? Okay.
That's me again. I just want to thank Mr. Jureš, who was actually leader of my master thesis last year on potential and limits of the Nordic cooperation, and Kenneth Broman. I met you 3 years ago at your office, where you told me one thing. I used it in my thesis in the final chapters. It's again about the public diplomacy of Nordic countries and cooperation in that field. I asked about the Nordic houses, as the Goethe Institute or the French Institute or other institutes of different countries exist. There is no system of Nordic cultural representations, not even separate ones. There is not even a system of Danish houses or Swedish institutes, only 2 of them in Paris and Berlin maybe. And you told me that it is probable, but maybe in 20 years. So now it's 3 years after you told me that answer, that it might be a policy of the Nordic Council or the Nordic Cultural Fund to concentrate this and systematize this policy. So I want to ask you, is there any progress in that terms?
So please, Mr. Jeresh.
It was actually to Mr. Broman.
Okay, sorry, Bruman.
Could you please repeat, was it about Nordic cultural houses?
Yes. Like, as you have in Reykjavik, in Tórshavn, and in Nuuk, and in Riga, and you said if you have, and you propose there might be a Nordic house outside Nordic region.
Well, this of course is internal Nordic, but as I see it for the moment, of course, this is up to the ministers of culture who are responsible of the houses and they take the decisions. But if you look at the whole of the Nordic cooperation, we are not building so much new institutions. We are more or less moving the other way. So to build new houses, of course, is a big process. The Nordic cooperation is very often criticized for having too many institutions and the whole budget going just to keeping this big organism alive. Ministers and many people want to have more free money to new initiatives. And of course, creating new houses is always a long process, and I stick to my guess then that I don't think it's going to happen very fast. But of course, as I said in my presentation, when we move outside the Nordic area, I think there's a huge potential for the Nordic countries acting together on the international arena when there is Nordic added value. And here during the break I spoke with, I don't know if it's a director for the Scandinavian House here in Prague, and there are some possibilities, and I think there are added value far outside the Nordic area for joining forces. But of course I'm not the right person to give a decisive answer on that.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Kjellberg wanted to say something. I think it's better.
Okay. It's about the Nordic brand and defense, and then the Arctic issue. Is there any development on that issue? Some words on that. We're talking about Nordic defense cooperation and then the Arctic issue. There's a lot of development going on. What on the defense side? If there is any words.
So is it hard to say?
I could start a bit about the Arctic. As I said in my presentation, historically the Nordic countries has dominated the agenda in that, like, it's because of the Nordic countries the Arctic Council has concentrated on environment, on ice melting, on the people living in the Arctic. That's not the agenda of Russia. That's not the agenda of USA or China. But and this is of course my personal opinion, I think the Nordic influence is getting weaker all the time because we have these new big players with totally big interest, and this is big politics now. So of course I think the Nordic influence is going to be less than we have seen up to now. But in a way I think that still we have done a tremendous job in the Arctic. And in respect to defense, I don't really, as you know, in the Nordic Council of Ministers, the defense ministers is not an official council, and we don't really deal with defense policy. But so I don't know if somebody else here at the panel wants to have opinions about that.
Well, I have very little to add, I guess, in terms of the defense dimension of it, although I would agree with your interpretation, and therefore the strengthening of the Council as an institution is, I think, the best way, or maybe the only way for the Nordic countries to make sure that someone talked about framing the other session, and I think it's a very good point here, that to make sure that the Arctic is not about defense, but about a much broader concept of security, where you have economic, legal, environmental, and many other things combined. So maybe on the framing side rather than on substantive defense cooperation.
So thank you. Are there any other questions? Yes, 2, 3. Okay, that's nice. So the woman, please, first.
Eva Kushatkwa, Norwegian Embassy. I have a follow-up question about the Arctic. Do you see, to Mr. Broman, do you see any division line between Norway and Denmark playing the big politics where the key issues are territorial boundaries in Arctic oceans and oil and gas fields, fish stocks and marine traffic routes, and the rest of the Nordic countries, Finland, Sweden and Iceland, on that issue, who are maybe calling for a redefinition of the Arctic regime, probably in the sense of something like Antarctic Treaty or something like that.
Of course, I have a cooperation. Now we have the ambassadors for both Denmark and Norway present in the room. But in my job, I have close cooperation with the senior Arctic officials, which are in the respective MFAs dealing with Arctic issues. And of course, just reading the newspapers, we know that Norway has a tremendous interest in Svalbard and the Svalbard Treaty, and this goes back to the 1920s. And Denmark, of course, has a long time been interested in the ground under Greenland and how far it goes up to Greenland. But I haven't seen any conflict between Norway and Denmark in this. In the Arctic Council and in the Arctic respect, it's more like of a how do we deal with this when we get Italian cruise ship cruising up in the northern parts of Greenland, and everybody knows that if something happens, everybody dies. If we have a big oil tanker with a massive leak somewhere in the northern, hundreds of nautical miles north of Iceland, what happens? I think I haven't recognized any difference, but knowing the background music, of course, there are some interests which are different. And you mentioned Sweden and Finland as well. Of course, Finland and Sweden not being coastal Arctic states as Denmark and Norway, they have a bit different approach to this, and more focusing on environment and environment protection, of course, because they don't have interest in the other side. But of course, the background here is resources and new routes and to get new international agreements on how to deal in this area. That's the main purpose. And in my work, I haven't seen big disputes with Denmark and Norway. No.
Okay. I saw some questions there. Okay. So, Mr. Ambassador, please. His Excellency.
Well, I'm sorry, it's not really a question, it's more a comment. When we talk about the Arctic, there is one thing that I think is very important to be aware of, and that is there is no need for new agreements to settle the question of how to deal with the resources in the Arctic. I would like to remind you of the Ilulissat Agreement, where all the coastal states to the Arctic agreed that we have the necessary legal framework in place. It's already there. And the basic treaty is the Law of the Sea Treaty. And what we talk about when we talk about developing new rules is basically in the environmental area. We talk about developing rules on how to better protect the environment. For instance, do we need to designate particular shipping lanes? Do we need to put more stringent requirements on ships trafficking the Arctic and so on? But the basic rules when it comes to resources, when it comes to the ownership of the resources, it's already in place.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to comment it? No. Okay. So, last question or comment. A gentleman with white
Good afternoon. Tomáš Juhás from Charles University. I would like to profit from this opportunity to ask a question I've been wondering about. And as we've heard in the first panel, in the beginning of the 90s, there were some major changes on the global level. But in the middle of the 90s, there were some more local changes on the EU level in connection with the Nordic countries. So we have passed from 1 member and 4 non-members to 3 members and 2 half or probably 2/3 members. I'd like to ask probably Mr. Bruman if he can confirm a statement that the character of the Nordic cooperation has changed in connection with this development, that Sweden, Finland and Denmark are now members, and Iceland probably becoming one, Norway somewhere in the middle. Thank you.
Thank you for the question. I think I will start with this misconception, which in my point of view comes from the referendum in Denmark in 72 or 3, when, of course, those of the Danish people who didn't like the European community, as it was called then, they used the Nordic cooperation as a substitute. They used it as a cause. And this has been sticking to the Nordic cooperation, that either you are in for European cooperation or you are in for Nordic cooperation. And in my point of view, this is totally wrong. The Nordic cooperation has never and will never be a substitute for European cooperation. It's totally different things. The European cooperation is very good at some things, and the Nordic this is a regional cooperation between countries which are very close to each other, and about people and the European structures are a total different thing. But of course, some things happened in 94, 95 when Finland and Sweden came together, and if you look at the documents on that, the Nordic cooperation was actually strengthened. The prime ministers took a very much firmer grip on the Nordic cooperation. After 94, 95, they decided that they will all come to Nordic Council sessions once a year and have a debate. And they have done that ever since. Before that, it wasn't so often. It was more on a day. So on paper, it was actually strengthened. But that was, of course, because there was this fear that this is going to be weakened. And looking on this, and especially about what Mr. Mats Brown said about the decision-making in the EU, the Nordic countries has always been very clear about there is no Nordic bloc in Europe. Of course, we are close neighbors, we speak to each other, and we have a so-called Imatra declaration where it's declared that ministers always meet before big meetings in Brussels to change views, sometimes make coalitions, find partners to get a majority, of course. So you speak together, but there has never been an ambition to form a Nordic bloc. There are many people and political scientists and other people who want a Nordic coalition, but up till now the government has been very, very clear about it. There is no Nordic coalition in the European. So it was very interesting to hear what Mats said about this, that you can actually not see it in the decision making. You can see some geographical patterns, and that was interesting to hear. But I don't think the Nordic cooperation didn't change so much after 94, 95. Not really, but of course the world changes all the time, but and so has the Nordic cooperation since, but not the big changes.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Juresh, you said one more. Yeah, okay. One more question. Martin.
Thank you. My last third question. It's defense related, goes back to the Stoltenberg report, which has, I think, 13 points, and most of them are defense. It's about defense. At the same time, the Nordic Council of Ministers, as far as I know, has no platform for defense ministers, not even on a low-profile meetings. So the question is there any will or plan to broaden Nordic Council of Ministers for the defense ministers?
First of all, Stoltenberg's report was not ordered or delivered to the Nordic Council of Ministers. it was ordered and delivered to the Nordic Minister of Foreign Affairs. So it has actually never been sent formally to the Nordic Council of Ministers. And as you said, it's about embassy cooperation and other things. And of course, we have been a part of a few recommendations there, but not most of them. To the question about having the defense ministers, and I will add here as well, the ministers of foreign affairs as formal councils, that has been a long discussion. And I don't know. Some people, some countries sometimes means that that would be a good idea because they meet anyway. But up till now, what I know, the defense ministers and the ministers of foreign affairs hasn't been so interested. They think this works very well on these matters, and especially amongst the Minister of Defense, what I've heard, like the Nordic countries has bought helicopters together, finding rescue and war things. So, finding Nordic solution, again, being small countries, grouping together, you're big, you get better prices, you can get better bargains. So there is a very good cooperation, and there are some informal discussions about this, but if I would make a guess, I don't think in the coming 5 years you won't see any changes in this, unless something big changes around.
Thank you. So, if you want to comment? No. So, we reached the end. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you, our speakers, for your contributions. And thank you, our audience, for your willingness and participation. It was a wonderful atmosphere here. So, I hope we will meet here another time. Maybe discuss something more. Some deeper integration, maybe. No. So, I declare the meeting closed, and have a beautiful rest of the day, and bon appetit.